How city walls evolved, and why the Theodosian walls were their greatest achievement. How do you stop an army? It sounds like a simple question, but for most of human history, it was the only question that mattered. How do you protect what you have built? How do you keep the people you love alive when something dangerous is moving toward you across the plain? How do you make a line in the earth and say this far and no further? For 7,000 years, that question drove one of the longest arms races in history. Every generation inherited a world of threats, and every generation tried to build something stronger than what came before. Attackers invented new weapons. Defenders invented new walls. Walls got higher, so armies built towers to climb them. Armies brought battering rams, so defenders dug moats. Defenders added moats, so attackers built bridges. This cycle repeated itself across millennia, through Mesopotamia and Egypt, through the Greek city-states and the Roman legions, through the medieval kingdoms of Europe, until it produced something that seemed almost impossible. A defensive system so complete, so intelligent, so thoroughly engineered, that it held for over 1,000 years against enemies who threw everything they had at it. The Theodosian walls of Constantinople. But to understand why those walls were extraordinary, you have to understand everything that came before them. You have to follow the full arc of this 7,000-year story, from the first frightened farmer who piled stones around his family's grain, all the way to the engineers who built the most sophisticated defensive system the ancient world ever produced. Because the Theodosian walls did not appear out of nowhere. They were the culmination of thousands of years of learning, failing, rebuilding, and learning again. They were the answer to an arms race that had been running since the very beginning of civilization. So let us start at the beginning. For most of human history, there were no walls at all. When our ancestors were nomadic, following herds, moving with the seasons, carrying everything they owned, there was nothing to defend. If danger appeared, you moved. The landscape itself was your protection. A mountain pass, a river crossing, a dense forest. These were the original fortifications, and they cost nothing to build because nature had already built them. Then something changed. Around 10,000 years ago, in a narrow strip of land between the Jordan River and the eastern Mediterranean, people stopped moving. They planted seeds and waited for them to grow. They stored grain in clay pots and built shelters to protect the pots. They came back to the same place, season after season, and then the village became a problem. A village has something worth taking. The earliest known town in human history sits on a mound in the Jordan Valley, a place we call Jericho. When archaeologists first dug into it, they expected to find the biblical city of walls and trumpets. What they found was far more interesting. Beneath the biblical layers, beneath the Bronze Age layers, at the very bottom of the mound, they found a Neolithic settlement dating to around 8,000 BCE. And around that settlement, 9,000 years before the Roman Empire, they found a stone wall. It was not a sophisticated wall by later standards. It was roughly 3 meters high and a meter thick, built from undressed stone without mortar, following the natural contour of the settlement. But beside it, they found something equally important, a circular stone tower, 9 meters tall, with an interior staircase. This was not just a barrier. This was a system. Someone in Jericho had understood that a wall without height gives you defense but not observation. You need to see what is coming before it arrives. That insight, that defense requires both barrier and observation, would drive every subsequent development in military architecture for the next 10 millennia. Çatalhöyük, in what is now central Turkey, took a different approach entirely. Around the same period, this settlement of several thousand people built no walls at all. Instead, every house was constructed directly against its neighbors, with no doors at the ground level. The only entrances were through holes in the rooftops, reached by removable ladders. The entire settlement was its own wall. An attacker who managed to climb onto the rooftop level would find himself in an open space surrounded by people who could pull up the ladders and disappear below. It was a community designed as a fortress, not through height, but through collective architecture. This was an early lesson that walls come in many forms. Sometimes the best defense is not a wall at all, but a way of organizing human space that makes attack expensive and dangerous. That lesson would also echo through the centuries to come. But as settlements grew into towns and towns grew into cities, the solutions became more structured. Wooden palisades, sharpened stakes driven into the earth in a continuous fence, appeared across early agricultural settlements from Europe to China. They were cheap, fast to build, and reasonably effective against raiders with bronze weapons. But wood rots, wood burns, and as settlements grew richer and more tempting as targets, wooden palisades were increasingly not enough. The first true city walls appeared in Mesopotamia, the region between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that we now call Iraq, around 5,000 years ago. And they appeared for a simple reason. This was the richest place on earth, and everyone knew it. Mesopotamia had invented writing, mathematics, and organized government. Its cities, Uruk, Ure, Nippur, Lagash, were the largest concentrations of human beings and human wealth that the world had ever seen. At its peak, may have housed 65,000 people behind its walls. That kind of wealth attracted the kind of attention that required serious architecture to discourage. The basic material of Mesopotamian fortifications was mudbrick, a technology that sounds primitive until you understand how it was used. Mudbrick walls were not thin. The walls of ancient Uruk, according to tradition attributed to the legendary King Gilgamesh, were 9 kilometers in circumference and 3 meters thick. They incorporated over 900 semicircular towers at regular intervals, an enormous number, each one designed to give defenders a flanking angle of fire onto attackers approaching the wall between them. This was not improvised defense. This was planned engineering. The principle of the flanking tower is one of the most important ideas in the history of military architecture, and it is worth pausing to understand it. A straight wall seen from above presents a fundamental problem. An attacker who reaches the base of the wall is in a dead zone. The defenders above cannot easily angle their weapons downward far enough to hit someone standing directly beneath them. The attacker is safe precisely where he needs to be unsafe. A tower that projects outward from the wall solves this problem. Defenders in the tower can fire along the wall face, hitting attackers who are pressed against it. The tower transforms the dead zone into the most dangerous place on the battlefield. Every subsequent improvement in defensive architecture built on this principle in some way. Egyptian fortifications developed during roughly the same period along the Nile and in Nubia showed a different aspect of the emerging science of fortification, the importance of psychological impact. Egyptian mudbrick forts were designed not just to be strong, but to look impregnable. Massive battered walls sloped slightly inward as they rose, which both increased structural stability and made them harder to climb, were decorated with elaborate crenellations and framed by enormous gateway pylons that communicated power and permanence to anyone approaching. The fort was a message as much as a mechanism. Come here and die. The best defense is sometimes the defense that discourages the attack entirely. Far to the east, the Indus Valley civilization built cities with a different defensive philosophy. One centered on urban planning, rather than explicit fortification. Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were laid out on precise grids, with standardized street widths, sophisticated drainage systems, and citadel complexes elevated above the surrounding city. The elevation mattered. A defender on high ground commands the approaches, sees threats before they arrive, and must be attacked uphill. Gravity is always on the defender's side, when the defender is above the attacker. These early civilizations were not just building walls. They were developing a vocabulary of defensive ideas, towers for flanking fire, height for observation and advantage, gates as controlled vulnerabilities, psychological intimidation as a force multiplier. Every one of these concepts would be refined, tested, and rebuilt over the following millennia, and the testing would be brutal. The great empires of the ancient Near East did not just build cities, they destroyed them. The Assyrians, who dominated the Middle East from roughly 900 to 600 BCE, were the most systematically destructive military force the ancient world had ever seen. They were also the most innovative besiegers. Sieges were expensive and dangerous. An army sitting outside a walled city was an army that was not moving, not foraging, not threatening anyone else, and slowly running out of supplies. The longer a siege lasted, the more it cost the attacker. So the Assyrians invested enormously in the tools and techniques that shortened sieges. They perfected the siege tower, a massive wooden structure on wheels, built taller than the enemy's walls, allowing Assyrian archers to fire down into the city from above while armored teams at the base worked battering rams against the gates and lower walls. Assyrian bas-reliefs show these towers in extraordinary detail, multi-story wooden structures, sometimes protected by hide soaked in water to prevent fire, pushed toward the walls across specially constructed ramps of earth and timber. Getting the tower to the wall required filling in the moat first, which required enormous quantities of earth moved under fire by thousands of laborers. The logistics alone were staggering, but defenders learned. Against siege towers, they raised their walls higher. Against battering rams at the gate, they built towers flanking the gate so that defenders could fire down on the ram crews from multiple angles. Against direct assault, they began developing the concept of the inner citadel, a second defensive line inside the outer wall, so that even if the first line fell, the attackers would find themselves in a killing ground between two lines of defenders. The Assyrians responded by developing siege mining, tunneling beneath the foundations of walls to create voids that would cause sections of the wall to collapse. Defenders countered by detecting the vibrations through shallow bronze bowls of water placed on the ground, then digging counter tunnels to collapse the attack tunnels or flood them. This underground war, invisible on the surface, was happening simultaneously with everything above ground. The Persians brought scale to the arms race. At the height of the Achaemenid Empire, Persia could field armies of hundreds of thousands, numbers that changed the mathematics of siege warfare. Against a force that large, even strong walls became insufficient if the siege simply continued long enough to starve the defenders. The Persian answer to a hard wall was patience and logistics, surround it completely, cut off every source of supply, and wait. This forced another evolution in defensive thinking. A city that might resist direct assault for months could still fall to starvation in a year. The response was the development of underground cisterns and granaries, water and food stored inside the walls in quantities sufficient to outlast a siege of months or years. The siege was now not just a military problem but a logistical one, and both attackers and defenders were competing in the management of supply as much as in the exchange of weapons. By the time of Alexander the Great in the 4th century BCE, siege warfare had become a highly specialized discipline. Alexander employed dedicated siege engineers, the earliest form of military engineering corps, who designed and built siege engines tailored to the specific defenses of each target. At Tyre, a Phoenician city built on an island, Alexander constructed a causeway across the sea to reach it, one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the ancient world, undertaken purely for military purposes. No wall was truly safe if the enemy had enough engineers, enough time, and a great general willing to attempt the impossible. The Hellenistic period that followed Alexander saw the most dramatic escalation in offensive siege technology yet. The torsion catapult, which stored energy in twisted bundles of rope or sinew rather than the flexing of a bow, could hurl stones weighing up to 100 kilograms with enough force to demolish masonry. The architecture of fortification had to respond. Walls got thicker, not taller, but deeper, with rubble fill between stone faces that absorbed impact better than solid stone. Tower profiles became rounder or horseshoe-shaped, because a curved surface deflects projectiles rather than absorbing them directly. The science of fortification was becoming genuinely scientific. Rome changed everything. Not because Roman military architecture was more creative than what came before. In many respects it was more conservative. The Romans were obsessed with standardization and system. A Roman legionary fort, a castrum, looked essentially the same whether it was built in Britain, Syria, or North Africa. Same rectangular layout, same 4 gates, same internal organization, same defensive ditch and earth rampart topped with a wooden palisade. The Romans understood that consistency was a force multiplier. A soldier who knew exactly where everything was in his fort could operate effectively in any fort. But what the Romans did differently was think about defense at the scale of an empire. Roman roads were military infrastructure. They allowed legions to move at speeds that no previous army had matched, 25 miles a day on a good road, sustained over weeks if necessary. This transformed the meaning of fortification. You did not need every city to be a fortress if you could move a relief army to any threatened point faster than the attacker could take it. The fortress and the road were a single system. Defense was not about walls alone. It was about time, about ensuring that help could arrive before the wall fell. The Romans also systematized the construction of walls in ways that had never been done before. Dressed stone laid in regular courses, with concrete cores that were stronger than either wood or mudbrick. The Romans' development of opus caementicium, their hydraulic concrete, gave them a building material of extraordinary strength and durability. When Roman engineers built a wall, it was built to last centuries. And when emperors eventually needed walls around Rome itself, they built accordingly. The Aurelian walls, constructed between 271 and 275 CE to protect Rome from the barbarian invasions that were beginning to threaten even the Italian heartland, are one of the most revealing documents in the history of military architecture. 19 kilometers long, 3.5 meters thick at the base, originally 8 meters high, with 383 towers spaced at intervals of roughly 30 meters, just close enough that the flanking fire from one tower overlapped with the flanking fire from the next, ensuring that no point of the wall face was out of range of a defender. The towers were 2 stories, projecting 5 meters forward of the wall face. The gates were designed with inner courtyards. If an attacker broke through the outer gate, he would find himself enclosed in a stone box while defenders above poured fire down from every angle. Every element served a function. Nothing was decorative. And yet even the Aurelian walls revealed the limits of Roman defensive thinking. They were designed primarily against infantry assault. The wall was vertical, high, and faced with cut stone, ideal against siege towers and scaling attempts, less ideal against the concentrated artillery that was beginning to develop. And more fundamentally, they were a single line. If the outer wall fell, there was no inner wall, no secondary defense, no system of depth. The Romans had refined the existing vocabulary of fortification to a very high level, but they had not yet reinvented it. That reinvention was coming, and it would be built on the Bosphorus. Before we get to Constantinople, we need to understand the full scale of what defenders were facing by the late ancient and early medieval period. The torsion catapult had evolved into the onager, a single-armed stone thrower of tremendous power, capable of hurling stones weighing 50 kilograms accurately enough to repeatedly hit the same section of wall. The ballista, essentially a giant crossbow mounted on a frame, could fire heavy bolts or stones with remarkable accuracy and range. And somewhere in the centuries between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the height of the Byzantine world, engineers in the Middle East and China were independently developing the counterweight trebuchet, a machine that would change siege warfare as fundamentally as anything since the battering ram. The trebuchet worked on a simple principle: a very long arm, pivoted asymmetrically, with a heavy counterweight on the short end and a sling on the long end. When the counterweight fell, the long arm rose with tremendous speed, launching the projectile in the sling in a high arc. The mathematics were elegant. A counterweight of 5,000 kilograms could consistently hurl a stone of 150 kilograms over a distance of 300 meters. With repeated strikes on the same point, a trebuchet crew could demolish almost any masonry wall given enough time and ammunition. And unlike torsion machines, which required skilled craftsmen to maintain and reset the twisted rope bundles, a trebuchet was mechanically simple. Almost any army that could build a windmill could build a trebuchet. The defensive responses were multiple. Walls got thicker, not taller, because height actually made a wall more vulnerable to impact by raising the point where the projectile struck away from the wider base. The ideal wall section against artillery bombardment was actually wider than it was tall, a low, massive, nearly indestructible barrier that absorbed and deflected projectile impacts rather than resisting them. Moats became standard. A trebuchet stone that hit the ground in front of a wall rather than the wall itself wasted its energy in the earth. And the space between the moat and the wall was carefully managed. Close enough that defenders could fire into it, open enough that attackers would be exposed during the crossing. Gatehouses evolved from simple arched openings into elaborate killing machines. A barbican, an outer gatehouse positioned in front of the main gate, forced attackers to fight through two separate fortified positions before reaching the main wall. Between the barbican and the main gate, the approach was typically flanked by walls on both sides, creating a narrow corridor where attackers were channeled and controlled. Murder holes, openings in the ceiling of gate passages, allowed defenders to drop rocks, hot liquids, or fire onto attackers who had managed to reach the gate itself. Every medieval gatehouse was a trap, designed to make the most dangerous part of the attack the moment of apparent success. Concentric defense, multiple rings of walls, each higher than the last, allowing defenders on the inner walls to fire over the heads of defenders on the outer walls, was the logical endpoint of this thinking. If one wall can be taken, have two. If two can be taken, have three. Never let the attacker believe that breaching any single obstacle ends the battle. The ideal fortress is one where every success for the attacker simply reveals another obstacle. By the time the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantine, was reaching its height in the late 4th and early 5th centuries CE, all of these ideas were available. What was needed was a reason to combine them into a single unified system, and an engineer willing to work at the scale that combination required. In 408 CE, the Emperor Theodosius II gave that engineer the greatest construction project in the history of military architecture. Constantinople was not an easy city to defend. That is the first thing to understand. Built on a triangular peninsula where Europe reaches toward Asia across the Bosphorus Strait, the city had water on three sides: the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Golden Horn Inlet to the north, and the Bosphorus to the east. Water was protection enough on those three sides, backed by sea walls that could be maintained relatively easily. But the fourth side, the western landward approach across the Thrace Peninsula, was completely open. No river, no mountain range, no natural barrier of any kind. Just flat ground stretching westward to the horizon. And from that flat ground, every army that ever threatened Constantinople came. The original walls built by Constantine when he founded the city in 330 CE were adequate for his time. But by the early 5th century, Constantinople had grown enormously. The population had expanded well beyond the original walls, and the political importance of the city, now the undisputed capital of the Eastern Roman Empire, had made it a target of a magnitude that Constantine's engineers had never contemplated. The Huns under Attila were pressing westward. The Goths had already sacked Rome. The world was becoming more dangerous, and the original walls were becoming less sufficient. Theodosius II was only 7 years old when he became emperor. His government, run initially by the regent Anthemius, made the decision to build a completely new land wall system, not an extension or reinforcement of the existing walls, but an entirely new defensive concept, positioned about 1.5 kilometers west of the original Constantine walls, enclosing significantly more urban territory. What they built between approximately 408 and 413 CE was not simply a wall. It was a system. The Theodosian walls consisted of 3 distinct defensive lines, each serving a different purpose, each complementing the others in a way that made the whole vastly more formidable than any single component. The outermost element was the moat, not a flooded ditch, but a wide, dry fosse some 18 to 20 meters across and 5 to 7 meters deep. The inner face of the moat was a low crenellated wall, the Persichizma, roughly 2 meters high. This was not primarily a defensive position. It was too low to hold against a determined assault. Its purpose was to keep attackers at a distance from the real defenses. A trebuchet stone that could demolish a section of masonry wall instead landed in the bottom of the moat. The moat absorbed the bombardment. Behind the moat and the Persichizma was a terrace, the Parabolos, roughly 15 meters wide. This was the killing ground. Any attacker who crossed the moat would find himself on this terrace, fully exposed, unable to advance quickly because the main outer wall was in front of him, unable to retreat because the moat was behind. The defenders on the walls above could fire in every direction without danger to themselves. The outer wall itself, the first true defensive line, was approximately 2 meters thick and 8 to 9 meters high, studded with rectangular towers at intervals of roughly 50 to 70 meters. These towers projected forward of the wall face, allowing flanking fire along the wall's full length. Critically, the towers were not the same height as the wall. They were higher, rising several meters above the wall walk, giving archers in the towers an elevated position from which they could fire over the heads of defenders on the wall below. 2 levels of defenders, each covering the other. Behind the outer wall was another terrace, then the great inner wall, 4 to 5 meters thick, 12 to 15 meters high, with towers rising to 18 or 20 meters that projected even further forward than those on the outer wall. The inner wall towers were offset from the outer wall towers, positioned so that there were no gaps in coverage, no angle of the outer wall face that was not covered by flanking fire from one tower or another. The geometry was precise and deliberate. Someone had done the mathematics. The gates were masterpieces of defensive engineering. The main military gates, the Golden Gate and others, required attackers to pass through multiple checkpoints, each one a potential killing zone. Outer gates led into enclosed courtyards, then inner gates, then more courtyards. At no point could a force that had breached the outer gates simply rush through. Every step of the entry process was controlled, funneled, and covered by defenders above. The towers themselves were not just platforms for archers. They were independent strongpoints, each one capable of being sealed and defended independently if the wall walk between them was taken. An attacker who managed to seize a section of the outer wall, already an almost impossibly difficult achievement, would find himself holding a narrow stretch of stone between 2 towers that were still in enemy hands, taking fire from both flanks. Holding the wall was nearly as difficult as taking it. The construction was extraordinary. The core of both walls was concrete, Byzantine opus mixtum, alternating courses of stone and brick with mortar joints that tied the structure together into a near monolithic mass. The brick courses served a specific structural purpose. They distributed stress across the wall face, preventing the kind of progressive collapse that could unzip a pure stone wall when a large section was damaged. When a section of the Theodosian walls was damaged, by earthquake, by bombardment, or by the inevitable ravages of time, it could be repaired in sections without compromising the integrity of the whole. The walls were designed to be maintained as well as to be defended, and they were maintained. For over 1,000 years, Byzantine emperors invested in the upkeep of the Theodosian walls with a consistency that was itself a form of strategic wisdom. Records survive showing emergency repair programs after earthquakes, routine maintenance schedules, garrison strengths for different threat levels. The walls were not just a physical structure, they were an institution, sustained across centuries by an empire that understood their value. The results speak for themselves. In 1,058 years of Byzantine history, after the Theodosian walls were completed, the walls were breached by hostile forces exactly twice, by the Crusaders in 1204, who came from the sea rather than the land and exploited an internal political crisis, and by the Ottomans in 1453, using technology that the walls were not designed to resist. Every other assault, and there were many, failed. The Avars besieged Constantinople in 626 CE, with a force that contemporary sources estimated at 80,000 men. They built siege towers, employed Persian engineers, launched simultaneous assaults by land and sea, and maintained the siege for weeks. The walls held. The Bulgars attempted multiple sieges over several centuries. The walls held. Arab forces under the Umayyad Caliphate besieged the city twice, in 674 to 678 CE, and again in 718 CE, and again, in 7 CE. The Russian Prince Sviatoslav threatened Constantinople in the 10th century. The walls held. Countless raids, probes, and assaults against the land walls over 11 centuries, and the system that Anthemius's engineers built in the early 5th century resisted them all. There is something almost metaphysical about this record. The Theodosian walls did not just protect Constantinople, they protected the continuity of Byzantine civilization, the preservation of Roman law, Greek philosophy, Christian theology, and 1,000 years of accumulated scholarship through an age that destroyed nearly everything else. When Western Rome fell in 476 CE and the ancient world began its long unraveling, it was the Theodosian walls that allowed one city to remain a living continuation of the ancient world into the medieval age and beyond. But no arms race runs in only one direction. The same forces of human ingenuity that had built the Theodosian walls were, across the centuries, developing something that no wall could resist. Gunpowder was known in China by the 9th century CE and reached the Islamic world and then Europe over the following 300 years. Its military applications evolved gradually, fire weapons first, then primitive guns, then increasingly powerful artillery. For most of this period, gunpowder weapons were novelties rather than decisive instruments. Early cannons were inaccurate, slow to reload, prone to exploding, and often less effective than a good trebuchet. The defenders of Constantinople had faced gunpowder weapons of various kinds in earlier sieges and survived them. But by the middle of the 15th century, the technology had reached a threshold. When Mehmed II assembled his forces outside Constantinople in the spring of 1453, he brought with him something the Theodosian walls had never faced in their 1,000-year history. A Hungarian engineer named Urban had built, for the Ottoman Sultan, a bronze cannon of a size that the medieval world had not seen before, capable of firing a stone ball weighing over 1,000 pounds. The sound when it fired reportedly shook houses miles away, and when that stone ball struck the ancient limestone and brick of the outer wall, it did not bounce, it did not lodge in the masonry. It went through. The physics were different from anything the wall had been designed to absorb. A trebuchet stone, however heavy, followed an arc and struck the wall at an angle, much of its energy dissipated in the impact, some deflected by the curved profile of the towers. A cannonball traveled flatter and faster, with a kinetic energy that the masonry could not distribute. And crucially, the Ottoman artillery did not fire once. It fired repeatedly, at the same points, day after day. The wall could absorb single catastrophic impacts. Byzantine engineers had known how to repair earthquake damage. But sustained bombardment of the same section, repeated daily for weeks, was something else. The defenders repaired desperately, hanging bales of wool and leather from the outer walls to cushion the impacts, filling breaches with earth and timber overnight. But the math was against them. 7,000 defenders against perhaps 60 to 80,000 attackers, with artillery that could reduce any wall section to rubble given enough time. After 53 days of bombardment, the Theodosian walls fell, not entirely, not permanently, but enough. The Ottomans stormed through a breach in the outer wall on the morning of May 29, 1453. The age of the vertical wall was over. The cannon had not simply created a bigger weapon. It had changed the fundamental physics of siege warfare. The entire logic of high walls, height gives the defender an advantage in fire and makes escalade more costly, was inverted by artillery. A tall wall presented a larger target and a higher center of gravity. When a cannonball struck a high wall, the wall was more likely to topple inward, potentially injuring the defenders it was supposed to protect. Height had become a liability. Thickness had become the only meaningful defense, and the thickness required to stop sustained cannon fire was far beyond anything practical to build vertically. Military engineers across Europe absorbed this lesson rapidly. Within decades of the fall of Constantinople, a new kind of fortification was being developed that bore almost no resemblance to what had come before. The response to gunpowder was geometry. The tres Italian, the Italian style of fortification that emerged in the late 15th and early 16th centuries, was the most radical redesign of defensive architecture since the invention of the tower. Its central insight was this: walls should be low, wide, and angled. Low, because a low profile presents a smaller target for artillery. Wide, because width absorbs cannon fire without collapsing. Angled, because an angled surface deflects projectiles rather than absorbing them directly, and because angled walls create overlapping fields of fire that cover every approach. The star fort, the bastioned trace, replaced the vertical curtain wall with a system of low earthwork or masonry platforms arranged in angular geometric patterns. The key element was the bastion, a projecting arrowhead-shaped platform positioned at regular intervals, allowing defenders to fire along the full length of each wall face with cannon. Where medieval towers had allowed archers to fire along the wall, bastions allowed artillery crews to fire along the wall, an entirely different scale of defensive firepower. The bastions were not just elevated, they were carefully designed so that every point of the outer wall face was covered by fire from at least one bastion, and ideally two. Dead zones, the places where defenders could not reach with their weapons, were eliminated by geometry. The mathematics of overlapping fields of fire, once worked out by Greek or Roman architects designing towers, was now being applied at the scale of cannon trajectories by engineers who thought in angles and arcs rather than heights and thicknesses. The moat survived, but transformed. The wet moat of medieval fortification gave way to the dry ditch, carefully shaped in profile to prevent attackers from using it as shelter, its floor cleared of any cover, its walls angled to deflect projectiles aimed at the curtain above. Additional earthwork outworks, ravelins, hornworks, crownworks, extended the defensive perimeter outward, forcing attackers to take multiple positions before reaching the main wall. The concentric principle survived, but expressed in low geometry rather than high stone. Paradoxically, the new fortifications were in some ways more difficult to take than the old ones. A trebuchet could demolish a vertical masonry wall with weeks of concentrated fire. A cannon fired at a low earthwork bastion simply buried itself in the earth, which absorbed the impact and immediately began reforming around the hole. The defenders could reinforce any damaged section overnight. The entire offensive advantage that gunpowder had given attackers began to be eroded by defensive adaptation. But the Star Fort was the end of a chapter, not the continuation of one. The Theodosian walls had been the apex of one tradition, the highest achievement of the vertical, massive, deep-layered masonry defense that had been developing for 7,000 years. The Star Fort was the beginning of a different tradition, with different principles and different aesthetics. Something had genuinely ended in 1453, and something genuinely new had begun. So, how do you stop an army? For 7,000 years, that question drove humanity to some of its most extraordinary achievements. The frightened farmer at Jericho who stacked stones around his grain was asking the same question as the Byzantine engineers who designed the Theodosian walls, and the Italian architects who first drew the angled profile of a star fort bastion. The specifics of the answer changed with every generation, because the nature of the threat changed with every generation. But the question never changed. What makes the Theodosian walls remarkable is not just that they worked for so long, though that alone would make them extraordinary. What makes them remarkable is what they represent in the arc of this 7,000-year story. Every element of their design was the answer to a specific question that someone, somewhere had first asked in a desperate moment of crisis. The flanking tower was the answer to the dead zone at the base of a straight wall. The moat was the answer to artillery bombardment aimed at the wall face. The offset positioning of outer and inner wall towers was the answer to the problem of fire coverage gaps. The independent strong-point design of each tower was the answer to the problem of holding a wall that had been partially taken. The Theodosian walls were not designed by geniuses working in isolation. They were designed by engineers who had inherited 5,000 years of accumulated defensive knowledge, who understood every previous answer and every previous failure, and who synthesized all of it into a system that was greater than the sum of its parts. The walls were the culmination of a tradition, the final and most complete expression of an idea that had been developing since the first stone was laid at Jericho. When they fell in 1453, it was not because they had failed. It was because the world had changed around them, because a Hungarian engineer had built a weapon that operated on principles outside the design envelope of anything that had come before. The Theodosian walls were designed against the best weapons of 408 CE. That they stood for 1,000 years against weapons far beyond anything their designers had imagined is not a failure. It is a testament. City walls were never just stone. They were never just a physical barrier between the inside and the outside. They were the most visible expression of civilization's oldest and deepest impulse, the belief that what we have built is worth protecting, that the people inside the walls are worth defending, that the accumulated achievements of a human community are not simply available to whoever is strong enough to take them. From Jericho to Constantinople, from the mudbrick towers of Mesopotamia to the angular bastions of the Renaissance, every wall humanity ever built was a statement of that belief. The statement was made in stone and mortar and timber and earth. It was maintained across centuries by engineers and soldiers and emperors who understood, in ways that are easy to forget in peaceful times, exactly what the alternative looked like. The Theodosian walls stood for over 1,000 years. For 1,000 years, they said, this far and no further. And for 1,000 years, the world listened. If you like this video, please like and subscribe our channel.